The morning started with the sound of grit whispering over stone, a dry hush like a prayer no one spoke aloud. Tamsin Vale listened to it the way a doctor listens to a pulse, weighing the cadence for signs of life beneath the earth. The wash below her claim curled through willow and greasewood, shallow as a teacup and colder than it looked. She knew exactly which riffle would hold a strand of color after last night's wind. The sky was so clean it seemed to ring when a hawk cut it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're from. If this story moves you, please subscribe. Tomorrow, I have a special story for you. She leaned her weight into the shovel, scooping a square of riverbed into the rocker she'd knocked together from packing crates and mule hardware. The boards creaked in a language she understood. Honest work, wear and give. The rocker sighed, water flashed, and small stones tattled across the riffles. She watched for the slow, shy blink of yellow that meant rent paid and beans bought. A fleck clung to the riffle like a stubborn star. She let herself smile, small and private. Cold ran from her wet cuffs to her elbow. Her skin puckered against the wind. A horse snorted somewhere up canyon, followed by the creak of a saddle she didn't recognize. She paused, silt trickling between her fingers, and let her breath settle. A mule of her own shifted behind her, stamping once in question. Tamsin clicked her tongue twice, the way she always did, habit more than thought, and bent to sluice the last pan of the morning. Out here, the trick to surviving wasn't force, it was angle. A pick set shallow, split rock as easy as a prayer splits silence. A mindset wrong, split a life in two. She dried her hands on her trousers and tugged at the cuff that hid the stitched-in fold of leather sewn into her left sleeve. People mistook her for small and spare because she kept to herself, because her voice seldom climbed past the register of a library. People saw the rocker and the pan and the mule with the rip in its left ear and assumed she was exactly what she looked like, one of 100 quiet prospectors pecking the bones of a played-out country. The sleeve hid more than patches. The town never needed to notice the weight that rested against her forearm in a holster so narrow it didn't print. The weight had names once. She didn't speak them anymore. The hawk coasted low, as if checking her arithmetic. Tamsin loaded the last of her gear into the cart and started the long trudge up the trail toward Drywater, the nearest map speck that called itself a town. It wasn't much. A street and a prayer. A box of seeds and a bell. A church that leaked sun in the mornings and whiskey at night. The road was a ribbon of pale dust and mica that glittered like frost. She walked it with a miner's patience and a hunter's quiet, shoulders squared against the wind, hat brim trained on the horizon. She'd timed it so the sun fell behind her by the time she hit the ridge. In the shallow valley beyond, Drywater crouched around its single well and 2 cottonwoods. Every building turned toward the road, like a dog listening. A sign swung on a rusted strap. Finch and Pike Mercantile. Ink letters fading where the wind always bit first. The smell of yeast drifted from a bakery no bigger than a freight wagon. Hammer music clanked where Orla Finn beat iron into shapes people swore were necessary. Necessary was a slippery word. Tamsin ran the numbers of her morning as she walked. $16 in change if Finch's scale hadn't mysteriously gained a pound since last week. Enough for flour, coffee, mule shoes, and the penny stamp she bought for letters she never posted. She felt the town notice her, the way a curtain lifted then stilled, the small attention of boots scuffing but not approaching, the soft, almost relieved sigh people had when they recognized a routine shape that never made a mess of a day. Tamsin returned the favor by being predictable. She tied the mule in shade, checked the water trough was more than a rumor, and went for the mercantile first. Myrtle Pike's pencil kept pace with her tongue. "You're late, Miss Vale. The flour from Carson's gritty this batch. I'll say it first so you don't throw it back at me like you did last spring." Didn't throw, set down with emphasis. You set it down like a woman sets down an ultimatum at the edge of a cliff. Myrtle's gray hair was braided in a rope thick enough to tow a string of ore carts. What's that dust worth you're hiding in that pocket and thinking I don't see? Tamsin took the poke from her vest and laid it on the scale. The beam nodded, and Myrtle's mouth did that thing where it couldn't decide whether to frown or be pleased. 16 even, Myrtle declared. You're stealing from me. Math disagrees. What you need besides flour and coffee? 2 shoes for left hind, nails, salt, matches, a spool of black thread, the paper with the weather on it even though it's all wrong. Salt's dear. So stubbornness, Tamsin said, and Myrtle snorted like a horse in winter. A wind went through the street the way wind does when it is accompanied by horses not from here. She didn't look. Not looking told men a lot if they were the kind of men who needed attention for a pulse. She could smell their coats before she heard their spurs, leather that stayed too long in a cave of smoke. One voice laughed without humor. One spat the syllables of a hymn wrong. Another carried a whistle that started a fight in your nerves and left you wanting to scratch. Myrtle's pencil slowed. Boys from the South Road, she said, too low to carry to the door. They blew through glory last week. Mason Creed with 'em. Tamsin kept her breath even as a doctor's. She slid the salt into her satchel, the thread, the matches, coffee, flour. The little bell above the mercantile door jangled like a trapped bee. Boots scraped the threshold. She felt their eyes before she saw them, the prickling attention, the way rooms tilt when men think they own all the air in them. A shadow broke across the counter, broad at the shoulders, brim curled like a sneer. Tamsin could make out the crackle of old sweat on canvas before she looked up. When she did, she met a pair of eyes the color of the drought itself, hard, unpersuaded, patient in a way that had nothing to do with kindness. "Afternoon," Mason Creed said. His voice was a hinge that hadn't been oiled since last winter. "Mrs. Pike, we'll be needing provisions for the road. And what's this? A small thing buying big with a pocket of glitter?" Myrtle's pencil stopped. "She pays like everyone. You want beans? You pay." He smiled the way a wolf shows children his teeth to teach them math. "I always pay. Question is who collects. I like to keep it tidy." He touched the scale pan and set it swinging. Tamsin let her gaze move the way rain moves over a hillside, measuring slope, reading shade, counting. Creed stood with weight balanced more on his heels than a drover would, not a saddleman first then. The man to Creed's right had a twitch in his left eyelid that didn't seem to bother him yet, but would in wind. The smaller one at the back hummed through his nose and kept his hands where she could not see them. Their leather told the road they traveled, their boots told what they thought of towns. She kept her voice low. "I'm done here." Creed gave an absent nod and slid aside just enough to remind her how the door required his permission now. His attention flicked to the poke she'd already tucked away. "Your veil. The one who camps in Black Willow Wash and makes church of her own company. Can't vouch the quality of the sermons?" He chuckled and did not move. "My boys and we've been collecting tithes from claims down canyon. We keep the road clean of trouble, and the road pays us for being so gentle. 1/3. We call it a courtesy." "Courtesy usually asks, last I knew," Myrtle said, and Tamsin could hear her knuckles go white around the pencil. Creed didn't look at Myrtle. "I'm asking, Miss Vale." She didn't look at the men's guns. Looking made a conversation about a different conversation. She met his eyes and measured the room again, where the counter could shield, where the glass would spray, where the weak board groaned if a boot pressed. She kept her voice mild. "No." Now there's a word that thinks it's bigger than it is. Creed shifted, hand still nowhere near his belt because a certain type of man believed confession was proximity. Hunters find tracks where tracks are. Wolves find lambs where lambs bleat. A woman alone with a good claim? The math writes itself. The lid of her heart tried to lift. She set a palm on it, firm. "I'm not bargaining here," she said lightly. "Just shopping." He looked at her the way men look when they want to put a story on your back because they are bored with the ones they are. He asked, "You shoot?" No, the truth as far as he deserved to measure it. She moved to step past, and he moved half a step into her path. The hum behind him turned, picked up, like a jar of flies shaken.
A voice from the street cut the tension. "Creed, take your shopping elsewhere." Deputy Rowe Calder stood in the doorway of the sheriff's box, hat pushed back just enough to make him look younger than the star tried to argue. His badge had been polished more than it had been tested. He put a hand on the butt of his gun like a man placing a candle on a wet porch. Creed's smile did not reach his drought eyes. "Friend, this road's ours this week. We'll be neighborly if neighbors keep their noses out," Calder said, before courage could think better of itself. "Out, or I go get Orla and her hammer and we start a choir." Tamsin used the argument like a door. She slipped past Creed while the men's attention hooked on the deputy's word. Creed's shoulder brushed her sleeve. She felt the question in that weight. "Who are you, small prospector with a voice like unvarnished wood?" She ignored the question until she was in the light, then let it hang where questions that didn't earn answers went. The air outside was clearer than it had any right to be. She tied her bundles to the cart and started toward the assay office without turning her head. The bell there was cracked, and the clerk, Mr. Dalrymple, had the soft, damp dignity of a bread roll. He weighed her dust, stamped the paper, signed with a flourish that tried to pull the eye away from the smallness of the sum. "See more strangers than town needs," he murmured, passing her the slip. "You might—" He swallowed whatever "you might" he had meant to offer and replaced it with a smile. "You might try the bakery's new thing. They say it's a pie that thinks it's a cake. Too many things out here wanting to be other things." She slid the slip into her pocket and stepped back into the light. On the way to the blacksmith's, she passed the Silver Horn, a saloon that wore out its welcome and painted it back on each day. Its windows were full of the wrong kind of quiet. She kept walking. The forge clanged in time with her steps. Orla Finn lifted a bar of iron that glowed like a truth you don't want to hear and laid it on the anvil. Sparks went up like gold that didn't owe anyone explanations. "Left hind?" Orla asked without preamble, eyes flicking to Tamsin's mule. "Again. That hoof's got a mind to argue with its own shadow." Orla's hammer rose and fell, shaping a ring with patience and temper. "You hear about Creed? Hard to miss him. Harder to miss what he does to a place if it lets him." Orla set the shoe to cool. "You're good at staying smoke. Stay smoke." Smoke lasted because it didn't pick a fight with wind. Tamsin nodded once. She paid in coin and thanks. Orla tipped the brim of her hat in a way that meant she saw more than she said. By the time Tamsin reached the wash again, the light had gone copper. The willow stirred like a gossip. She cooked beans that wanted more than salt and watched the line of hills darken, their ribs, their old scars, the creek that wrote itself again each spring. She ate, cleaned the pot with grit and a handful of grass, and wrote 3 lines in the small, hard book she kept wrapped in oilcloth. June 11th. Found color at Riffle 4. Cold wind. Men who don't ask. The mule, patient as a bell, laid its head against her shoulder while she wrote. She rubbed the notch in his left ear and murmured nothing words to him until the muscles along his jaw softened. Fire crackled, a language of its own. Night pressed close with the blunt affection of an old dog. She slept the way people sleep when sleep and waking know they may need to trade places without notice. The scrape came at moonset. Leather on stone, a breath held wrong, a knee careless against a tin cup. Tamsin rolled from the bedroll soundless as poured water and palmed the short hickory stick she kept beneath the blanket. She let her breath climb no higher than her collarbone and counted. The mule twitched an ear and did not move. The shadow near the mule's panniers did. "Set it down," she said, voice low enough to tuck under the creek murmur. The shadow froze, a young outline, shoulders that learned swagger before they learned consequence. He straightened slow and showed a hand splayed to the air, empty. Tamsin felt the second hand curled around something by his thigh before she saw the shape of the knife in the moon-wet light. "Set that down too," she added. Silence strained until it creaked. Metal kissed rock as the knife settled. "You're quicker than you look," the boy said, voice trying out 2 or 3 counties to see which sounded least like fear. "It's a lesson, not a compliment. Leave the pannier you opened. Back up 3 steps. Hands up." He obeyed in the way boys obey when they are gauging how much the universe intends to enforce the lesson. He wore a hat that wanted to be a crown, and boots that had not earned the mud on them. Close up, she knew the twitch she'd clocked at the mercantile belonged to him.
"You Mason Creeds?" He lifted his chin. "I'm my own man. Then you won't mind walking away your own self." He tried on a grin. "Mason don't like to be told no. Then Mason will learn something new." She kept the stick loose in her hand, weighed on the balls of her feet. "Walk." He started backward. She matched him with 3 forward, keeping the space the way a shepherd keeps sheep between a feed sack and a cliff. When he reached the edge of the wash, he hesitated, eyes flicking to the knife he'd dropped as if gravity could be argued with by pure nerve. Tamsin tapped the stick once against the stone. The sound was small. It carried a great distance. "I know the road." He licked his lips. "Mason'll come calling tomorrow." Tamsin felt the knowledge settle like a coin on a ledger. Tomorrow's not here yet. He swallowed what he wanted to say and turned, making more noise in retreat than he had in approach. She listened until sound quit answering sound. The mule blew out its breath. She let hers out after. Dawn unclenched the ridge in pinks and pale gold. She brewed coffee that scolded the cold out of her lungs and ate a biscuit gone to rock. Before she packed the panniers, she took a moment she had not taken in months. She unstitched the left cuff enough to slide a fingertip inside, feeling for the seam that wasn't a seam. The leather sheath there warmed her skin like a secret. She didn't draw the little gun. She didn't need to. The knowledge of it was a compass turned to true. Creed kept his promise about calling. He came with the sun high and a laugh already balanced on his lips like a coin flicked and waiting to come up heads his way. 4 with him this time. The twitching boy among them glanced down and away when Tamsin met his look. She stood with the rocker between them as if it were a table set for 5. She dabbed her wrist in the water and let a ribbon of it fall back into the pan. If they made her nervous, she gave it to the water to handle. 1/3, Creed said, amiable as a snake half asleep. "No." "Lady says no. Hear that, Jory?" The twitching boy swallowed. His name fit his jaw like a new bit. Creed considered the wash, the willow, the mule, the rocker, the woman. A pattern pressed into his face as if a thumb pushed from inside. "I admire a spine," he said. "Most don't bother keeping one out here when it's not fashionable. Spine does a person good when the world asks you to bend for stupid reasons." "Smart mouth," he said. "Be ashamed to break it." He moved his hand, not toward his belt, but to his hat brim. The movement was light, nothing at all. The message was heavier than a church bell. Tamsin held very still. Men like this measured reactions for sport. She heard, rather than saw, the boy Jory's breath hitch. She heard the creek, which didn't care about sport. Creed's smile thinned. "Tomorrow, then, we'll host a service in town. You bring your tithe, Miss Vale. We'll pass the plate after. Won't be there. We'll come collect." They rode off the way men ride when they think the land is a table they've paid for.
Dust climbed after them, reconsidered, and went back to sleep. Tamsin let herself count to 30 before her hands started moving. She packed the rocker and the pan, the coffee and thread and salt. She checked the mule's shoe and the cinch and the strap that always wanted to lie. She did not look at the willow or the riffle. Love made you slow at the wrong time. In dry water, fear had already made itself a couple chairs and sat down. The silver horn was a pressure cooker. Laughter rose too fast and died too quick. Deputy Calder ran a thumb under his collar as if it had shrunk in the heat. Orla Finn's hammer struck a little harder than the iron strictly required, and twice as true. Tamsin set her cart beside the bakery and walked to the sheriff's box. The sheriff himself had gone north a week ago for a trial and had not returned by virtue of a road that made a man reevaluate his ambitions. Calder looked up, surprise quick and unhidden across his face. "Miss Vale," he bobbed his head. You don't. You're not for town business." "I am when town business is a man like Creed asking everyone to co-sign his violence." Calder winced, as if the word had weight. "I posted a notice," he nodded toward the paper on the wall, where Mason's requisition of 1/3 called itself a public safety measure in ink that didn't deserve the paper it married. "I thought maybe if it looked official enough we could make theft into a ceremony."
He flushed. Young didn't always mean untrue. We're outnumbered. The arithmetic's not just bodies. Calder rubbed the bridge of his nose. The arithmetic is also the law, and I got one badge and no deputies because the pay's bad and the prospect's worse. Orla will stand. So will Myrtle. So will the bakery when you take their yeast hostage. He blinked at that, then smiled despite himself. You're not wrong. Tamsin pulled a folded paper from her pocket and slid it to him face down. He frowned, flipped it, read. The ink there wrote a simple thing in a hand both neat and decisive. Not today, not this street, not this town. Beneath, 3 names already scrawled themselves into the future. Orla Finn, Myrtle Pike, a line of ink she recognized as the baker's wife's mark. Calder swallowed. This isn't a law. It's a line, she said. Law is just a line people agree to honor. Start honoring early, maybe it teaches the rest of the body how to stand up. He looked at her the way people look when a thing starts to make more sense than it has any right to. You'll stand? I'll attend, she said. Standing is a word that gets ahead of itself. She crossed to the Silver Horn as afternoon slouched toward the hour when lamplight learns to keep its nerve. Inside, the smell of old whiskey and new sweat braided itself into a rope that could haul anything the wrong way. Mason Creed stood at the bar as if he owned the timbers by virtue of leaning. His men arranged themselves in a scatter pattern that was only an accident if you had never seen an accident hired to look like it came by on purpose. Tamsin took a table nearest the wall, back to the boards, eyes on the mirror behind the bar because mirrors were honest when people weren't. She set her hands flat on the table so the room could see they were empty and thought about water under ice. Creed lifted his glass to her. Miss Vale attends church. I hear there's a collection. Amen. His drought eyes raked the room. Friends, Drywater's crossroads have been a little dangerous lately. Road agents, snakes, men with ideas. We aim to staff the road with a little order, for a very small percentage of your future comfort. No one objected out loud. Objections moved in the dark, planning their escape. Tamsin studied the mirror and found the boy Jory trying not to watch her while watching her. He had a look of a lad who had been told a story and then sent out to find himself inside it. Myrtle Pike marched in without her pencil for once and set both fists on the bar. You collect from me, you do it with a receipt signed by the man whose name is on the territory map. Otherwise, your tithe is a wish. He smiled a shape that suggested he'd pull the sun out of the sky if it made him feel handsomer. I will collect from you, Mrs. Pike, in the language you understand. He rapped his knuckles on the plank. Now, Prospector, plates being passed. Tamsin let silence make a point, then stood and moved to the bar with a slow economy that belonged to a different room where choices weren't staged like a play. She placed her poke on the plank, then took it back again. You collect once. Tomorrow there will be 2 collections. The second will be mine." He laughed, honest and sharp. "Hear that, boys? The small thing intends to levy taxes." "Call it interest," she said. His amusement deepened into something uglier. He reached for the poke. His sleeve rose when he did, and the scars on his forearm wrote the story he would prefer other people to read. Tamsin shifted her weight a hair to the left and put 2 fingers on the poke as well. Their hands touched, knuckles to knuckles. His skin was hot as a stovepipe in July. He squeezed to test. She didn't move. His eyes narrowed in a degree only a mirror would admit. "He has argue point. I am as well. What says your point?" "He has the right to argue what point you make." She still moved a finger in knowing this. "An ideation, a tone controls kill them. Use more sugar and charge them more. Or even better, don't try to cone a smaller tale. Using the con stay afloat, when the more we sow rare." Common sense totally died. "Tomorrow then. Noon. Road. Offer is the same. A third, and we walk away friends." Friends was an ambitious noun. She did not argue it. She picked up the poke, turned, and walked back to her table, the room's gravity tugging at her like the tide. Outside, the sun slid toward iron. The cottonwoods along the well wrote their leaf notes against the light like a company of paper singers. Tamsin stood at the edge of the street and looked at what a line did to a place when it remembered it could draw one. She felt the sleeve with the hidden leather seam. She did not touch it. That night she didn't sleep, not because of fear, because of arithmetic. She set 3 bottles atop the bar of the Silver Horn long after the crowd emptied, after Myrtle had gone home and Orla had covered her forge, after Deputy Calder's boots had worn the floor in a narrow oval of worry. The barkeep, a man with a face built to be forgiven, watched but did not ask. Tamsin moved the bottles until their reflections in the saloon's long mirror stacked in a row that would show her the street twice, once forward, once backward. She marked the floor by feel in the dark, where the knots rose 1/8 of an inch. She paced the width of the doorway blindfolded. She sat on the step until the east learned its first color. When light finally clarified the street, she walked it slow, the way a surveyor walks his own heartbeat. She noted where boards creaked, where dust piled, where wind curled. She found a nailhead that stood too proud and pressed it flatter with the heel of her boot. The world noticed when you argued with it. She argued gently. Noon arrived looking exactly like a man who believed it never met a debt it couldn't enforce. Mason Creed rode down the street with 4, and a 5th straggled behind because bravado doesn't always train its feet. People at windows made of themselves opinions. The bell over the mercantile door trembled and kept its counsel. Orla stood in the blacksmith's mouth with her hammer in her hand, face carved in the patience rock saves for river. Tamsin stood in the center of the street and listened to her blood. She heard the creak by the wash because she could not hear it here. She thought about the bottle reflections in the mirror and what they would show if someone stood where she was now. She thought about the boy with the twitch and the knife. She thought about 1/3 of a town and whether it measured more than steel. Creed reined in 10 paces away. Dust rose, rolled, and sat down to watch. He smiled like a paper cut. "Church is in session. Plate's been passed." "I brought mine," she said, and set the poke on the dirt between them. He glanced at it the way a man glances at a moth drawn to a lamp. "And the second collection?" "My turn. I'm collecting a street." He laughed, long enough for the men behind him to join from habit. When the laugh was tired, he leaned forward. "What are you, Miss Vale?" "A quiet prospector." He shook his head. "No, you're something that thinks it's hiding under a hat and a habit. I can smell it." She let the words pass without catching on them. "You can give to the second plate, or I can take the plate back." "You'll take," he said, gently, not as threat, but as certain weather. The world narrowed. She heard the small complaint of the nail she had pressed flat in the saloon last night. She heard her mule at the far end of the street grumble over a fly. She heard the slow exhale of Deputy Calder from the sheriff's box. Tamsin let those sounds line up like fence posts. She felt the seam against her wrist where the leather sheath waited, and the part of her that had sworn not to draw from it again laid the oath on a table, squared its corners, and slid it aside. "Jory," Creed said without looking back. "Little test." The boy nudged his horse forward, color sluicing out of his face. Tamsin watched his hands. They wanted to shake. They wanted to be brave. They wanted to be anything other than hands told to do a coward's work. "Take the plate," Creed said. The boy dismounted, boots sounding too loud for the space between heartbeats. He bent toward the poke, his fingers brushed the twine, and he looked at Tamsin the way boys look at water when they know it's going to be cold and they have to go in anyway. "It's a test," she said quietly. "You can fail it and live." Jory's jaw worked. "Mason'll learn," she said.
He closed his eyes once, like a prayer had to pass through a narrow door. Then he stepped back from the poke and retreated to his horse without touching it. The twitch in his eyelid fluttered once and steadied. Creed did not move. The men behind him shifted, confusion like static. "Boy," Creed said, voice soft. Soft could be worse than loud. "I said, take the plate." "No," Jory whispered. Creed's hand moved, casual as a man picking lint. He wasn't casual. Tamsin saw the shoulder tighten the way a storm tightens just over the ridge. She saw the horse's ear tip, the dust ring falter, Orla's knuckles go small on the hammer. He'd shoot the boy. He'd do it because a story demanded a sacrifice, and he liked to play priest. Tamsin's palm was already resting over the seam. Her body moved without asking the part of her that liked words for permission. She stepped half to the left to bring the mirror at the silver horn into the angle she'd marked, and the sun swung into a place it seldom consented to hang, just enough to lay Creed's shadow long across her boots. She drew. No one saw the gun until they heard the first ring of metal on metal from the cafe sign down street, where her bullet struck the bracket and sang, ricocheting into the tin cup nailed to the mercantile post, bouncing again into the bell over Finch and Pike's door, which exploded into a jangle so bright even the mule startled. Creed's hand stalled to the space at one bright sound. In that space, Tamsin's second shot burned the air between his hand and his heart and punched the buckle clean off his belt without touching flesh. The leather slithered through the loops. His gun, only then half clear, clapped to the dust like a child told to sit. Someone screamed. She thought it was the room she had made of the street. A third shot clipped the rawhide lariat at the hip of the man to Creed's right. The loop he was sneaking wide behind her dropped and went sleepy on the dirt. A fourth made the glass of the silver horn's door blossom without bursting, the crack a cobweb that stole sight from whoever might be watching from inside with a rifle. She did not breathe. Breath was for after. Hands remembered what they had promised never to brag about again and did their sons clean and quiet. She centered Creed's second gun, the little Winter he kept in his vest, and put a hole in the vest where it lived without opening him. He froze. Dust settled. Somewhere a fly reconsidered a pie. Tamsin heard the sound the world makes when it finds out it had a choice all along. She sparked the hammer back with her thumb, felt the old geometry lock into place, and fixed Creed in a sight picture so intimate it might have been a confession. She saw the exact mote in the air above the bridge of his nose. She saw the tiny nick in the nick of his ear. She saw the need in him to turn the moment into blood, because that was the only currency he believed had purchase. "Give to the second plate. Give the street back," she said. He shook his head once, small. The drought in his eyes looked for a spring and found insult instead. She sighted on the strap that held his holster to his thigh and took it. The leather snapped. The holster sagged against his boot, carving embarrassment where bravado had been. Orla's hammer tapped once on the anvil like a gavel. In the doorway of the sheriff's box, Calder stood with his gun drawn but lowered, as if it had become a pointer more than a weapon. The boy, Jory's breathing came back into his chest and set up house there like it meant to stay. Creed lifted both hands shoulder high, palms out. You think you've won. You think the road doesn't stretch more than a mile in any direction. I think noon doesn't get to be the only hour that matters, she said. He nodded, as if she had solved an equation that had offered him grief for years. Then the hour will come find you somewhere you didn't plan to stand. His eyes flicked, just for a pencil's width of a second, over her shoulder to the rim of the Silverhorn's roof. Her own eyes followed reflex before discipline could scold. There, low behind the false front trim, a glint. Not glass. Steel. A man she had not counted in her mirror work, his barrel pressed to a chip in the paint that made a perfect keyhole to her back. The world narrowed until it was gunmetal and nerve. The street exhaled. The bell over Finch and Pikes gave a single soft note, as if the wind had put a finger to its mouth to shush it. The mule at the far end stamped once. Tamsin pivoted, already measuring angles she had not walked at dawn, already solving for wind and sun and what a bullet could do with its small body if it believed in angles more than in straight lines. Creed's breath touched her back of the neck the way lies do when they mean to become true by proximity. The rifle's mouth blinked at her like a lizard. She drew a breath she hadn't meant to draw, and let it go as
a held note instead of a gasp, the breath smoothing her hands to silk. The rifle's blink on the Silverhorn's false front steadied into a pupil. She let the world narrow to angles and timing, to the way light bounced off paint and tin and the tiny gullies time cut in wood. Her left foot shifted a whisper, half the width of a nailhead, until the double image in the mercantile window lined with the one in the saloon's long mirror, two streets stacked into a single truth. This story took us a long time. If you like it, subscribe. Now, back to the story. She moved as wind moves through barley, quick without hurry. The little gun came home to her hand like a tool to its bench. The first shot went not toward the eye at the keyhole, but to the sliver of tin that held the cafe's awning, struck and peeled off singing. It kissed the cracked bell above Finch and Pike, then skipped again toward the roofline where dry paint makes dust like flour. The dust leapt in a pale veil. The eye coughed. The rifle yawed. Her second shot split the gap between sun and shade, took the nail that kept the false front trim from sagging, and the whole 8 feet of frill groaned and slumped forward like a curtain, embarrassed to be caught listening. The shooter swore, a human sound with a note of surprise she recognized. Men seldom expect geometry to pick the fight. She didn't aim for him. She aimed for the shadow of his barrel and bit it off at the muzzle with a kiss of lead that left the steel ringing like a struck rail. The rifle jumped and went ugly. A hand jerked back as if a hornet had changed its mind about who to love. Silence fell, the way a deck of cards falls when the store you were dealing scatters. Creed's breath reached the back of her neck, hot as a lie. She turned back, and his eyes, drought hard, had learned a new word. Not fear, not yet. Calculation finding out it had missed a class. "You're not what you sell," he said quietly. "I sell dust and quiet, both honest." He crouched and picked up his belt without taking his eyes from her. He looped the leather back through with dignity, a king re-crowning himself after the crowd laughs. His men sat like dogs told to hold. The boy Jory's mouth was open just enough to drink the air and not drown. "Take your street. We'll take the road." He lifted his hand shoulder high, palms soft, a gesture that could read as peace or promise. Noon's not the only hour that matters. Neither is tomorrow. They rode out, two looking back and one humming that nasal hymn he tortured when he thought it made him taller.
Dust lifted and settled as if reconsidering its loyalties. Tamsin did not put the gun away until the sound of their horses braided fully into distance. Then she reloaded slow, counting aloud so her hands couldn't get ahead of her pulse. She slid the little weapon back into the seam at her wrist and felt the leather accept its weight like a familiar responsibility resumed. People unpeeled from windows and thresholds with the shy caution of deer itched by curiosity. Myrtle Pike came first, pencil back in fist, as if she'd finally remembered her own right name. "You brought a bell to heal with a bullet. Either that or the bell stands up straighter for you than for the Lord. Bell just likes attention," Tamsin said. "So do bullets." Orla Finn's hammer touched the anvil twice, not quite a clap, more like a benediction. "Come by my shop when your heart quits shouting. I'll look at that seam you wear like a secret." Deputy Calder's lips worked around words he hadn't grown into yet. "Miss Vale, Thank you sounds small." "Small often fits where big can't," she said. "You posted a notice. That counts." He nodded, eyes going to the roofline where splinters and paint dust still sifted down. "They'll be back." "I know." He swallowed, young again. Will you? "No one person can stand for a town," she said gently. "But a town can stand for itself. Start today, finish later." He nodded like he'd been given more homework than his desk could hold, and went to fetch a ladder. She felt the drain then, the way a riverbed feels itself after a flood, shocked and stubborn, riddled with new shapes. She picked up the poke she'd laid at her feet, and found it dusty but whole. She tucked it away, turned once in a slow circle to count the faces of the street, and only then felt the tremor she'd kept out of her hands climb into her knees. She breathed through it until it found better work. In the afternoon, she let the town pretend it didn't watch her watch it. She mended the slight tear the recoil had made in the seam at her cuff, and sat at the pump with a cup of water until the cup forgot it had a tremble. She wrote in the little book 3 harder lines than yesterday's. June 12. Street held. Creed saw more than he said. Boy said no. Angles obedient. Toward evening, Orla's forge threw a daylight of its own into the alley. Tamsin stood in it and listened to iron talk about how it prefers to live its life. Struck, cooled, struck again until it remembers the shape it was meant for. Orla handed her a leather patch and a curved needle. "You sewed that holster yourself." Orla's tone held no question, only an invitation to admit the satisfaction of a thing built by one's own hands. "I stitch quiet," Tamsin said. "It holds better." Orla nodded. "Quiet's a kind of rivet." She paused, eyeing the street. "The boy looked at you like a map looks at a compass." "Maps lie when they think it will make the world simpler." "Compasses lie when the mountain's got iron in it," Orla said, grinning. "Don't let him fix you with his notion. Boys like that think you were put here to rewrite their endings. Boys like that deserve not to be somebody else's cautionary tale. You can't collect all the strays. I can collect the ones in front of me." Orla set the hammer down, the sound smaller than it had any right to be. "They'll bring more," she said. "Not just numbers, something longer, something that drinks from further away. Rifle, or the man who thinks he's a rifle." Orla's mouth did a shape that might have been a prayer if she'd believed in anyone else to do the work. "She said there's a fella down river, calls himself Whit Law, hunts buffalo with a rod that breaks bone at 1/2 mile. Creed hired him 2 months ago to settle a grudge with a rancher who liked his fences too tall. Whitlaw. The name put a taste of cold iron in Tamsin's mouth. She filed it where names go when they're going to matter whether you want them to or not. By full dark, the street had quieted to the creak and murmur towns make when they think they're alone. Tamsin went to the Silver Horn. The barkeep, Avery Holt, a man whose apologies began in his eyebrows, handed her the key without comment. She set 3 bottles again on the bar, aligned them with the mirror's long, honest ribbon, and walked the boards with her eyes closed until she knew which planks told the truth and which told a story first. She left through the back into the alley, where bread and coal smoke shook hands. The sky was thick with stars and the particular hush of places that believe night is a roof. She took 2 steps and felt, rather than heard, the decision being made behind her. It had the weight of a body trying to erase itself. She did not turn. "You're not good at quiet yet," she said. Jory edged out of the shadow near the broken crate and stood where the lamplight warmed the corner of one eye. The twitch there had learned to wait. He held his hat with both hands like it might shiver if he didn't. "I didn't take the plate, you saw." "I did. Mason's gonna take something for it, from me or from someone else who don't deserve it. He's like that. What did you come to ask?" He worked his jaw and found nothing in his teeth except regret. You always been like that, with a gun?" "No." She let the word be a whole answer for a moment, then allowed a little more. "I was worse, then better. Then I put it away. It came when I called today because I called honest. You could teach me." The want in the words wrote a whole sad future if someone didn't erase half of it now. "I could teach you how to breathe. I could teach you how to count, how to listen until listening changes what you think you have to do. But a gun isn't a hymn. You don't sing it because you like the sound. You sing it because the roof is leaking and the buckets are already full." He blinked, trying to build a house out of that. "He's gonna come late. He likes late. People get sloppy with their fear."
"What do you want to do when he comes?" Jory's mouth trembled, then steadied. "Not stand where he told me to?" "That's a start," she said. He looked down at his hat. "He's got Whitlaw sniffing the road. Law's bad. Not because he's mean, because he don't care. It's a hole where a person goes. Then we fill the hole with something else." She stared at her as if she'd offered him a new color. "What?" "Work, chores, angles. Carry that crate across the alley without making it complain. Twice. Then go home and sleep with your boots under your bed where you can find them in the dark." He squared his shoulders around the assignment like it weighed exactly what he could lift. "Yes, ma'am." He started for the crate, then stopped. "He'll take his tax from somebody tonight anyway. If not coin, then a bruise. Then we'll try to be where the bruise thinks it wants to land." She left him to the crate and went to the sheriff's box. Calder sat with his elbows on his knees, badge catching starlight like a moth wing. He started to rise when he saw her and wince halfway through. Fear lives in the back muscles when pride sleeps too hard on the chest. "Walk," she said. "No talking until the talking is about something we can lift." They walked the street end to end twice, stepping in time to their own heartbeats until the hearts gave up pretending to lead. She made him stop at each doorway and listen. She made him close his eyes and name the sounds he heard. Rope on wood, the shush of cottonwood leaves, a mule flicking flies, Myrtle's curtain arguing with the hook. The third time at the Silver Horn, a new sound entered, the stale hiss of men breathing like they thought the night couldn't hear them. "Back," she said, and put a hand flat on his chest to hold him where the shadow owned the street. She counted breath lengths until the new sound attached itself to a place. Behind Orla's forge, to the left of the quench barrel where footsteps might look like water if anyone came nosing. They went down the alley, soft-footed as gossip. Orla met them at the rear door, hammer already raised, face clean of surprise. "I heard him," she said, as if commenting on the weather's choice of hat. "2, maybe 3.
They're cowards because they picked night. Cowardice makes its own kind of stupid. Water barrel. Left. Orla's mouth curved, a blade approving a whetstone. I can fetch the right sort of accident. She vanished and returned with the bucket, barely managing how much it wanted to spill. On your mark. Calder's throat worked. We could arrest them. Do you see the law? Tamsin asked softly. Is it standing here with us in proper clothes? He shut his mouth on righteousness and tried on practicality. It fit. Tamsin took the bucket and the hammer and gave Calder the none-too-subtle job of being something noisy if she told him to be. She slid into the shadow of the barrel and waited. Men rustled nearer, talking quiet but carelessly, their sense of entitlement stepping on their sense of self-preservation. Take the tongs, throw 'em through the window, she'll come. If she comes, she gets laid down. Creed says we put a mark on the place for tomorrow. And the boy, Creed says a lot. I say we finish the bottle afterward. Snort. I say we finish it during. Tamsin waited long enough to read their feet by sound. One dragged a little on the right, one wore heels that bit the boards like a jealous dog. The third kept time with his own breath. She let the listening alter something in her hands, then nodded toward Orla. Orla flung the back door wide and let fly the bucket. Water gushed like a creek taking a corner too fast. The men jumped, swore, slipped. Tamsin was already moving. The hammer's wooden handle kissed the heel-biter's wrist hard enough to make a prayer out of his hand. The water made the alley floor a lyre beneath the dragfoot. He went down hard on his own elbow and discovered a new faith about pain. The breath counter found himself counting the air that went out of him when Calder, brave because he had been told how, hit him with a length of broom handle exactly once. It was ugly work. Quick only because they committed all the way to the ugliness. Orla pinned the heel-biter's forearm under a boot and looked down at him the way a mountain looks down at a complaint. Are you trying to buy your courage on layaway? She asked, and when he spat, she angled his wrist until his language changed. Tamsin put her knee on the dragfoot's shoulder and took his knife away neat like he only noticed when the knife appeared in her hand. She tossed it into the water barrel and heard it hit with a sound like punctuation. Tell Creed that his late-night tithe found the wrong church. Wit'll put a hole through your sermon, breath counter wheezed.
Then Wit can bring his doctrine to daylight, she said. I don't tithe to cowards. They let the men crawl away, damp and humiliated. Calder stared at his broom handle as if it had spoken deep philosophy to him in a kind voice. Orla wrung out her apron in the doorway and watched the alley clean itself. You're gonna have to choose, Orla said after the water stopped talking, between being the quiet thing you were and being the sound we all heard today. You can't be both all the time and not bleed out from the seam. I know. She didn't say which way the math leaned. Math knows when you flatter it. At dawn, a coal of sunrise lit the far rim. Tamsin saddled the mule and rode out along the wash to walk the contours of a day that felt taller than it had any right to be. She saw the places men would choose to lie if they wanted a shot at the street. She saw where the wind would carry smoke if somebody thought fire was a tactician. She saw tracks that had been careless on purpose to hide the careful ones. She saw Whitlaw's print and thought of a cold room with trophies on the wall that called themselves meat. At a bend where Willow leaned like eaves over a pew, she found Jory waiting, hat in his hands again, boots on his feet this time, as instructed. The twitch in his eye had taught itself a new patience overnight. I told him no, again, he said, without preamble. He laughed. Laughing's often a sign a man is trying to sell you the thing he knows you don't need. He says bring you to the cut banks by sundown, or he takes the baker's boy to the same place and chooses which lesson sticks best. The world did a small tilt. Tamsin felt it and refused to let her expression catch the angle. I know he won't bring anyone to the cut banks who didn't volunteer. He also knows you'll go, with or without me. Without me, she said,
because your job is to keep watch on Myrtle's porch and cough once if anyone comes from the south." He swallowed arguments and wiped his palm on his trousers. "Whit'll be there." "I expect so." "He's faster." She almost smiled. "No one's faster than a problem you refuse to count right. I'll count him honest." Sundown came dressed in brass and dust. The cut banks were a rib cage where the wash had taught the earth humility. Swallows stitched the light from one edge to another. Tamsin walked in, mule left tied where he could argue with grass. She kept to the shadow where the bank leaned forward, where a man with a buffalo rifle would have to adjust his mathematics. Creed stepped from behind a cottonwood with a showman's timing. He had the baker's boy by the collar, but not roughly. When men want to be seen as civilized, they grip children like china. The boy's lip had gone white with biting it. Tamsin cataloged him in a glance and then set him aside. Panic kills aim faster than bullets do if you let it roam. "You came. I told it had grown 2 inches. It liked that." He smiled. The drought in him enjoyed an oasis of its own cruelty. "Whit," he called conversationally. "Be neighborly." Whitlaw's voice came from the shadow 30 yards east, low and somewhere far away at once. "I can see her eyelashes from here. That good enough?" "Let's find out," Creed said, and tightened his grip on the baker's boy by a fraction that was a thread dressed as a caress. Tamsin stepped sideways into the gap between 2 slants of light she had measured on the walk-in. Her heart climbed into her throat and sat there, feathers up. She let it. Fear had its chores, too.
"Whit," she said, keeping her tone like the flat of a hand smoothing a wrinkled map, "this isn't buffalo range." "Mate's meat," Whit said. "Some walks on 4, some walks on 2 in lectures." "You ever shoot a kettle from 100 paces without spilling the water?" she asked. A small amused exhale. "I shoot kettles from a 1/4 mile and they thank me for helping them boiled." "Then you know all about steam." She let the word hang, then put a second word beside it. "And whistles." Whit laughed, actually laughed, and she caught what the laugh echoed, behind a flat rock, waist high. His barrel would lay along it like a long finger. "You're going to try a trick," he said. "I like tricks. Tricks are just math with better manners." She let her hand find the seam, felt the leather answer her, and stood still enough to count the dust motes arguing in a shaft of sun. She didn't aim at Whit. She aimed at a granite face the wash had polished 30 feet to his left, where the angle set by winter floods offered a sly shoulder. First shot hit, and broke itself into pieces small as rain. Somewhere far to her right, the baker's boy flinched. Creed's hand tightened again by reflex, and as reflex traveled through his wrist, a second shot took the buckle on his vest with surgical disdain. The vest sagged, his grip changed. The boy twisted and stumbled 2 steps to freedom. Because children are born with a math for mercy, adults forget. "Stay low," Tamsin said without moving her mouth. The boy went to dirt so fast he might have been trained from birth for it. Whit's rifle coughed, and a piece of the bank 6 inches from her ear came off at an argument she hoped to never referee again. She slid sideways and fired again, this time at a knot in the willow above Whit's rock. The knot spat sap and leaf shade, and something in Whit's calculation flinched. His second shot sheared a branch that ducked when he told it to stand still. "You're making me work," he said, without rancor. "You make yourself work," she said. "I'm just handing you tools." He chuckled, and the chuckle told her which of the shadows was rib, which lung. She put a round into the bank a foot to the left of his muzzle and counted 3 beats. On the third, the ricochet came off the granite face she'd woken with her first shot and tapped the barrel like a schoolmarm. The muzzle cracked sideways, and the 4th shot dug a hole in a place Whit had no interest in murdering. "Careful," she said. "You'll have to switch shoulders or adopt the lamp." Silence rolled. Not offended, intrigued. Creed broke it. "Whit?" "Still here. Learning." Tamsin heard the boy whimper, and felt the whimper tug at the part of her brain that still had a claim to her hands. She let the tug pass through her like wind through willow, set the sight on the laces of Creed's boot, and took them. The boot side open. Creed cursed and stepped back, not injured,
only rearranged, and sometimes rearrangement is humiliation's older brother. Calm moved through her, a kneeling animal. She breathed into it and let it breed more of itself. "Leave the boy," she said. "Take your road. I'll keep my street." "Or?" Creed asked, but the or had less confidence than it wore to town. "I'll count you honest," she said, "all the way to the bone." Witt's rifle shifted in the shadow. She felt it like a weather change on skin. "I won't hit the boy," he said. "Not with you writing these numbers like a schoolmarm in a choir. Choirs know when to sing and when to let the silence carry a verse." Creed waited, the way men weigh whether they want to look stupid now or later. He let the boy go, and the child ran the way small animals do when the world remembers to be kind for a breath. The boy went sure-footed to the angle Tamsin had chosen for him in the bank and vanished into it like a letter into an envelope. She let herself count to 4 before giving the bank a new notch with a shot that sent down a curtain of dust between Witt and the rest of the scene. "Enough," Witt said, cuffing. "This one's got church bells in her pocket and mirrors in her sleeves." "Tomorrow, we come with more," Creed said, now the only one pretending noon held all the clocks. "Bring less," she said. "It's lighter." They withdrew, Witt last, moving like a man who can afford to admire the person who didn't die because they didn't need them to. Tamsin stood until the wash took the hoofbeats and ate them. Then she let her legs do what they needed to, which in that hour was more knees than dignity. The boy's mother cried at the threshold of the bakery without making a sound. Tamsin took the sound into herself and filed it with every billet she hadn't spent. Deputy Calder stood straighter than his age and nodded once for nothing in particular. Orla watched the horizon with her arms folded, as if measuring how much metal it would take to build a fence around a day. That night, a rider came in a hurry that smelled like more than just dust. His coat wore a badge that said law and a smile that said private property. He nailed a paper to the sheriff's box with a flourish usually reserved for weddings and funerals. By the lamplight, Myrtle read it in a voice flat enough to hold a lake. Territorial Warrant, 1 Tam Vale, alias Thomas Vale, alias T. Vale, wanted for armed mischief, obstruction, and the unlawful carrying of a concealed weapon on a public way. To be apprehended by any officer or duly deputized citizen.
Calder flushed. Armed mischief? Men who are afraid of their own words make new ones, Myrtle said. She looked at Tamsin. Tam Vale. People hear what they expect, Tamsin said. They heard a quiet prospector and put a he on it. I never fetched it back for them. The rider with the badge that looked purchased more than earned tipped his hat as if he had performed a magic trick worth applause. I'll have to ask you to come along peaceable, he said to Calder while his eyes stayed on Tamsin. Or we might have to invent less pretty words for later. Calder squared his shoulders around his new homework. You'll need me to read you the part where jurisdiction is a saddle you don't just climb into because you like how it looks. The rider smirked. Son, I brought my own saddle and 3 more behind me. The 3 behind him unfolded from the dusk, men with hats tired of the heads beneath them, hands that knew how to pick their noses with a trigger. Orla stepped into the street, hammer on her shoulder and voice like iron that refuses decorative curls. You nail any more of your papers into my friend's door and I'll nail your boots to your horse. Ma'am, I'm a patient man. Me too. I've been waiting all day for someone to try me. Tamsin reached past the argument and put her hand on Calder's sleeve. Paper's a kind of line, she murmured. If we make it only about ripping it down, we teach them to staple it twice. If we make it about reading it out loud and making the town choose what it believes, we write something over it. Calder swallowed, then raised his chin and read the warrant again, slower, adding at the end in his own voice, which this office does not honor as written, being untrue in fact and unkind in intent. Myrtle added her pencil to the paper in a stab of graphite that wrote her name like a verdict. Orla put her hammerhead to the page and left a crescent moon of soot. People stepped forward, one and then another, and touched the paper with whatever they had. A finger smeared with flour, a smear of coal, a tiny cross meant only as a mark. The writer watched, baffled by a grammar he had not studied. "Tomorrow," he said finally, borrowing Creed's calendar, "the territorial captain comes with a wagon that speaks faster than your mouth. He'll take the prisoner and settle the rest with the street." "A Gatling," Orla said after he was gone. The word sat heavy as a horse trough. "They'll park it at the well and call it language." Tamsin felt the seam at her wrist like a pulse. "Then we make the street a different kind of sentence." They worked until the east went thin. Myrtle strung laundry lines in ways that made alleys out of open air. Orla welded hinges where there hadn't been doors. Calder and 3 boys, not old enough to vote, but old enough to choose, carried barrels where barrels never thought they'd live. The baker's wife laid sheet pans along windowsills to throw sun like a deck of mirrors. Jory stood where she placed him and learned a new verb, listen, but not with ears alone. She put a tin cup on a post and made him close his eyes and point to it by sound. When he could put his finger and not be wrong twice, she handed him a broom handle and said, "Now you have a longer finger." The day arrived with the stomping boots of 50 men trying to be more than they were by standing shoulder to shoulder. A wagon came with a skirt like iron teeth and a crank that promised prayers and smoked them both. The territorial captain wore a mustache with ambitions of office and a sash that made him look like a birthday cake getting ideas. "Tam Vale," he called, as if the street were a church and he a choir. "By authority vested in me by the territory and by men who sign on respectable paper, I place you under arrest for interference and sundry." "Which interference?" Myrtle asked flatly. "The kind that keeps boys from dying?" The captain smiled with 8 of his teeth and none of his heart. "The kind that keeps men from collecting what they're owed." He gestured, and the Gatling's mouth turned slightly toward the sheriff's box, as if it had smelled its own paperwork and found it wanting. Calder stepped forward before nerves could call him back. "You will not fire on this street," he said. His voice trembled once, then found the timber a town could brace a ladder against. "Son, I don't converse with furniture." He nodded at the crank. "The first spin is always the most honest. It tells you who the man doing the spinning thinks he is." Tamsin saw the man at the crank roll his shoulders like a gambler, not a soldier. She catalogued it, and the way the wagon sat with its left wheel shy of true, and the way the barrel of the Gatling cocked its head as if to ask permission of a future it didn't belong to. She took one step and put herself between the street and the mouth. She did not draw. She lifted her hands, empty as a prayer answered too late, and made her voice the size of the boardwalk so it would fit everybody's ears at once. "You've got the wrong prospector," she said to the captain. "The one you want can't count past 1. I can count you all the way down." The captain blinked and laughed because he didn't know a better verb. "Take her," he said, and put a hand to the brim of his hat as if it might blow off in the wind she'd promised. Something moved on the Silver Horn's roof, a small tilt, a glitter. Tamsin's stomach remembered the man she hadn't counted in her mirror once, and the lesson the day had been trying to write across her back from the outset. Angles always hold secrets until they don't. Creed's voice drifted from the alley like a rumor proud of itself. "Told you the hour would find you where you didn't plan to stand." She felt the seam against her wrist work its way into her bones like a decision you think you're still weighing. She looked at Calder, at Myrtle, at Orla with the hammer like a promise, at Jory with the broom handle poised at a tin cup no one else could see. The crank hand flexed. The Gatling's barrel lifted its face to the level of her heart. A gloved finger settled on the trigger. A second hand touched the crank. Tamsin took the breath she hadn't meant to take and let it go as the first teeth of the Gatling began to bite the air. And the street discovered there were silences thinner than sound. The first clatter from the Gatling's throat was not thunder, but teeth learning to chew.
Tamsin felt it in her ribs the way you feel a wrong note skim your bones. She did not draw. Not yet. She had promised herself that drawing would be the last verb, not the first. The wagon's left wheel shivered on its axle, a fraction off true just as she had tallied, and the man at the crank rolled his shoulders like a gambler warming a wrist. The captain's sash glared under the noon as if it could command the sun to salute. Creed's voice ghosted from the alley, proud of itself. On the silver horn's roof a glint tilted, hungry. Tamsin lifted both hands higher, palms outward, and turned her head the smallest margin toward Deputy Calder. The boy Jory, already poised, saw the angle and breathed once, deep. His broom handle tilted, its end resting against the tin cup she had hung on a post before dawn. A whisper of wood against tin made a note no wider than a hair. The laundry lines came down like a grammar the town had rehearsed in secret. Myrtle jerked one knot, and a sheet unfurled, white and holy as a surrendered sky. Then another, and a third, a sudden congregation translating light into confusion where the Gatling had expected an easy catechism. The baker's wife flicked her wrist and let a pan go from her hands. Sunlight shattered on it and scattered back in coins that stung the crankman's eyes. Orla stepped sideways and leaned her shoulder into a wedge she had fitted under the wagon leaf spring, iron speaking iron in a language of leverage. "Fire!" the captain barked, but his bark hit cloth and mirrors in a street that had remembered its own name. The first burst sprayed high, shredding laundry that had no blood to give. White scraps fluttered like surrendering birds and then fell, not surrender at all, but cover. Myrtle hauled a second knot, and a rope of damp shirts swept like a pendulum and slapped the Gatling's barrel, linen wrapping it in its own new word, tangle. Tamsin moved when the barrel stuttered. The seam at her wrist breathed, and the little gun came to her hand with the steadiness of an instrument held by someone who had decided to play only the necessary notes. She did not aim for men. She aimed for the grammar of their weapon. One shot punched the pivot pin on the feed tray. The pin leapt like a tooth cuffed by an embarrassed jaw, and the tray sagged. A second took the crankman's glove where it wrapped the handle. Skin spared, leather snagged. The glove flopped and tangled the crank's own rhythm. A third found the screw that balanced the tripod cheek and worried it loose. The Gatling's mouth dipped, then lifted, unsure where to face. "Hold her!" the captain cried, and 4 rifles lifted as if yanked on a single string. But rifles need eyes, and the street had denied them. The sheet pans along window sills poured sun back into their faces. The cottonwoods dropped a sudden rain of coins, leaves shaken by a boy on a branch who had been told to make wind when wind was asked for. Something quickened above, roofline, right. Tamsin saw the rifle's keyhole wink again. Creed's man with the glint hadn't learned much from earlier. She snapped and took the bracket of the sign 3 doors down. Sound leapt, ricochet hopping, bell answering, angle obeying. A 4th deflection kissed the eave and snapped a splinter against the keyhole's rim. The muzzle jumped. The roof shooter swore into his sleeve. The Gatling's barrel freed itself from the shirt and rose, angry now. The crankman found his rhythm beneath the wrap of his ruined glove. He grinned, a man reassured that his machine loved him more than it loved physics. "Down!" Tamsin shouted, the first loud word she had given the day, and it wasn't panic, but instruction. She went to one knee on a board she had chosen at dawn for that exact reason and pressed her weight where it would not complain. Jory dropped. Calder dropped. Myrtle ducked behind the mercantile's counter in a fold of motion that had more dignity than any bow a judge had seen take. The Gatling chewed. Wooden teeth flew from the hitching post. Dust leapt and tried to be smoke. A barrel by the well sprouted holes in a neat, boastful row and began to pour water like a man who realizes too late he has been shot.
Orla, still under the wagon leaf spring, hauled her wedge with a roar. The left wheel hopped its track with a metallic sob, and the whole carriage lurched, muzzle yawing, the string of its fire sawing harmless slashes into the false front of the barber shop where wigs in the window showed more courage than their owners had paid for. Tamsin's next bullet took the locking pawl that kept the feed from skipping. The pawl pinged away like a promise broken in private. The belt slithered and jammed. The crankman cursed and yanked, and the handle bit back. His knuckles cracked with a sound the whole street heard with guilty satisfaction. "Arrest her!" the captain cried, abandoning doctrine for desire. Two of his men stepped forward because men always do what an audience demands when they lack an audience inside themselves. Jury lifted the broom handle as if it were the finger she had named it and touched the tin cup twice. Two pans flashed sunlight across the men's faces, a slap without hands. They paused, their bodies remembering that sight and certainty are lovers who dislike being cheated on.
Creed's laugh came rich with condescension. "A prospector and her bedsheets," he drawled from the alley. "Look at the sermon you let yourselves be preached. You needed a Gatling to be told where to stand." He stepped into the light with his drought eyes full of a new kind of weather and lifted his revolver, leisurely, as if the day were only a meal delayed. Tamsin sighted on his holster strap again, habit wanting to teach the same lesson, but a shadow flickered to her left that was not sheet, not tree. Whitlaw, hat low, rifle in the crook of his arm, stepped into the street as if he had been born there and had just come back for mail. "Captain," Whit said mildly, "your man at the crank isn't a soldier. He's a blacksmith's mistake." The captain's mustache bristled with the effort of indignation. "You'll be paid to shoot, Law, not to editorialize." Whit considered the Gatling with the calm of a butcher measuring a steer. "That wheel's off true. Your man will tear the carriage down trying to make a reputation before supper. That belt will chew itself to lace and jam, and there's flour in the air." He glanced at the bakery and its dust of white on the wind. "If a stray spark catches, you'll write a new kind of story on your own face." "Do as you're told," the captain snapped. "Sometimes a man survives by forgetting who told him what," Whit said, and lifted his rifle. He did not point it at Tamsin. He laid the sight on the Gatling's belt and fired once. The bullet cut the cloth like a letter slit, and the feed sagged into a useless dangle. The crankman spun anyway. Pride is slower to jam than gears, and the Gatling clattered and whined without ammunition, a hungry mouth gnawing its own tongue. Creed, robbed of a spectacle, aimed to make one. He raised his revolver toward Tamsin's heart with a suddenness that did not suit his calm. She saw his wrist telegraph, the way it always did in men who liked to rehearse their cruelty. She fired first, a fraction before his talent could catch up to his intention. The bullet nailed his coat cuff to the plank post at his left. He jerked and tore the fabric and swore something that had someone else's mother in it. "Enough," Whit said again, not to Tamsin, not to the crowd, but to the kind of day that confuses escalation for meaning. He worked the bolt with a small, tender sound and sent his second shot to the captain's sash, cutting it clean through so that it fell with humiliating grace into the dust. Laughter skittered at the edges of the street like quail. The captain turned red around his eyes and purple around his pride. "You're under arrest," he snarled at Whit. "You didn't bring enough paper," Whit replied, which coming from him was something like a man who'd eaten too much meat admitting he needed fruit. Calder found his voice, and when he did it felt taller than it had yesterday. "Captain," he said with a steadiness he had borrowed from his own future, "you pointed a war engine at a street full of citizens on a charge this office refused to honor. You attempted to enforce theft with ordnance. Lay down your weapons. You will not leave this town in command of anything but your boots." "Boy, You barely keep order in a barber shop. I carry orders from men who can erase you with a telegraph." "And we carry names," Myrtle said, pencil in fist like a gavel, "of boys you'd have erased. We carry them on paper here." She thumped the sheriff's desk and her ledger answered like a drum. "Some paper matters more than yours." The bottleneck of the moment pulled tight. She could feel it, the possibility that this would end with a sudden line of bullets because a man didn't like being publicly downgraded from noun to verb. She raised her gun a hair, not to command, not to threaten, but to suggest. She sighted on the captain's hat brim and took it. The hat somersaulted from his head and landed noble as a dead crow. The street inhaled. Then, as if exhaling equaled agreement, 8 rifles dipped in the captain's retinue, and 8 men found that their fingers, for once, were stronger at letting go than at holding on. Iron clattered on planks. The crankman nursed his bruised knuckles like the selfish child of machinery he was. "Deputize me," Witt said to Calder, almost lazily. Calder blinked. What?" "Say it," Witt said, as if instructing a new hunter on how to bleed a hog. "Say Whitlaw is deputized for the purpose of disarming an engine pointed at women and boys." Calder swallowed. "By authority vested—" He paused, smiled a little at himself, and tried again. "By the power we all agreed to grant this office until we replace it with a better one, I deputize Whitlaw to cut the belt on that monstrosity and escort it out of town on foot." Witt tipped his hat toward Tamsin first, then to Calder, then to the memory of someone who had taught him to say "thank you" out loud. He stepped to the Gatling, took a length of Orla's chain from him like he'd been asking to borrow sugar, and chained the crank in place. When the captain protested, Witt looked at him the way a hunter looks at weather, unimpressed by complaint. "You pointed this at a bakery. My gratitude is thin." Creed had not holstered his gun. He had not moved. He had also not smiled in 3 breaths, which for him was concession. His drought eyes found Tamsin and read her not as a woman, not as a prospector, not even as a rival. She read her as a reference book she didn't own.
"You wrote a new rule," he said. "I don't like new rules." "You like rules that make you taller," she said. "This one only makes you smaller if you measure wrong." He lifted his chin and called toward the roof without moving his mouth much. "Dale," he said, "come down." The Glint man did not answer. He had left by some shingle route and left his pride behind, like a shirt he didn't like the smell of anymore. "Go," Tamsin told Creed. "Take to a road. If you come back for a tithe, bring truth to pay the asking." He thought about shooting her then. She could see it. She could read the small hitch in his shoulder that meant his hand wanted to be admired more than it wanted to be wise. She sighted on his belt buckle without blinking. He let his hand fall. Rage will get a man killed. Vanity will get him mocked. Creed hated the second worse. "Tomorrow," he said out of habit. "Today," Tamsin said. "You'll run out of tomorrows faster than you think." He took his men and a fragment of his swagger and left. The captain stayed because humiliation nails men to places faster than fear. Witt walked the chained Gatling like a bad dog toward the far end of the street with 2 of the captain's men in sour attendance. The townsfolk did not cheer. They are not that kind of people. They did something better. They went back to work. Tamsin felt her hands begin to shake now that work allowed it. She sat on the Silverhorn step and let the tremor set up camp in her wrists until it got bored and went to find a different carnival. Jory sat too, careful not to lean his trembling shoulder against hers unless she said he could. She did not say it. She let them share a step and a horizon instead. "You didn't kill nobody," he said. The relief in his voice was not simple. It had edges. He was learning what many men never do, that restraint can feel like a bruise you chose. "Not today," she said. "I prefer arithmetic that leaves room to balance." He nodded as if he'd been taught a new way to carry a number. "What now?" "Now I take off this seam," she said, touching the place where the leather lived against her skin, "and I put it back on, and I take it off again, until I can wear it without forgetting its weight." He frowned, trying to build furniture out of that. "You leaving?" She looked down the street where Orla's hammer sang again, and Myrtle's pencil squeaked, and the baker's boy carried a tray too big and did not drop it. Calder read the warrant one more time, and then folded it into a paper boat and set it in the horse trough. The boat sailed for 3 feet and then sank with dignity. Tamsin felt something unclench that she had not known she'd been carrying since she first taught herself to count. "Not today," she said. "Tomorrow I'll decide." Wit returned as the sun softened to the color of held copper. He had left the Gatling at the edge of the flats with its crank chained and a note pinned to its cheek in Orla's blunt script. "Property of men who don't deserve it. Collect after you've learned your nouns." He stood before Tamsin and lifted his chin the way men do who don't tip hats to equals because it feels like a lie. "You write a street," he said. "I can read it. I don't choose to live on it, but I can read it." "Then read this," she said. "You picked a side." He smiled like a man who had found out a scar meant he'd survived. "I picked a target," he corrected gently. "For once it wasn't a man." He paused, eyes flicking to Jory, then the bakery, then the mercantile where Myrtle was already redrawing her ledger's margins. "You'll have to keep choosing. The choosing will be the whole work." "I know," she said. "You done with Creed?" Wit took off his hat then, surprising himself with the respect in the gesture. "I was done with Creed when he pointed a war engine at Bread." He settled the hat. "I'll put word down river. Some men like a reputation with a spine in it. They'll hear about a street that stood, and the woman who taught it verbs." After the light went to blue, Tamsin walked to the wash and let the day rinse itself from her ears. The mule rubbed his jaw against her shoulder and huffed approval, or expectation, or a mixture of both. In the little book she wrote more than 3 lines and less than a long letter, and this time she did not close it with the briskness of a ledger. She let it rest open until the ink settled. June 13. The machine ate air. The town remembered to breathe. Creed taught nothing new. Law shot cloth, not lung. Captain lost a hat and discovered he was smaller than his sash. Jury is a cup that can hear. Mirrors obedient. Sheets brave. Angles remain angles. I remain. The next days were made of repairs, not celebrations. Nails went in. Holes got patched. Myrtle invented a new category in her ledger called refusals, and under it wrote the names of men she would not extend credit to because their eyes measured other people more than they measured themselves. Orla forged 2 brackets that held nothing but promise and mounted them over Calder's door. The baker made cakes from ruined flour and gave slices to boys who had been told not to climb the cottonwood and did it anyway, to view where the world goes when you look from higher. The captain slunk out at dawn, his men trailing, the chain clanking in the wagon bed like a conscience. He left his cut sash in the dust. Myrtle swept it up and nailed it to the sheriff's box where the warrant had been, a ribbon made humble by use. Calder did not remove it. Sometimes a lesson belongs exactly where it can rub a man's shoulder when he reaches for his hat. Creed did not return for 3 days. The street learned to stand without looking over its shoulder every 12 breaths. On the 4th morning, his shadow arrived first, then his hat, then his voice. He rode alone. Men who ride alone either had made a decision or lost one. He reined to a stop 10 paces from the well and looked at Tamsin, who had been sweeping the step because sweeping is a way to think that doesn't insult dirt. "You were right about tomorrows," he said. "I often am," she said. "It's a habit I try to use sparingly." He looked at his hands as if wondering if they had always been the size they were now. "A dozen left me," he said, "after the day you wrote. The rest stayed because they liked their names pronounced wrong. You're here for a sermon or for a map?" He laughed once and found the sound thinner than it had been last week. "A dare," he said.
I dare this street to stand without you telling it how. It will, but I'll be here, so your dare is lonely. He stared at her like a man staring at a river he hadn't expected to respect. You're not afraid of me. She considered it. I am, she said, but my fear works for me. It carries barrels, it moves mirrors, it tells boys where to stand. Your fear works for your pride. He turned his horse as if the turn had been put on him by a tide. I'll find another road, he said. You'll find the same road, she said softly. The work is to walk it different. He did not answer. He left without swagger. It was the only time she ever saw him smaller than the shadow his hat made. One evening, when the wash sang low, Jury came with news that tasted like iron before he said it. "They're talking in glory," he began. "Men with wagons, men with papers signed by someone who thinks the railroad owns the sky. They say the creek isn't ours to drink. They say no town that can't afford their music gets to dance." Tamsin sat with the little book closed and her hands empty because she suspected she would need them so. "Then the street goes to the creek," she said. "Not to fight, to learn its song so well no man can pretend it's his." They went at dawn. The town in work clothes, not war clothes. Orla wore her leather and a smile that had decided who to pity. Myrtle brought a ledger and a ribbon. Calder brought the warrant boat, now folded into something that thought it could be an airplane. The bakery sent bread, because bread does more democracy than speeches ever manage. They stood where willow leans and swallows stitch air. Men with wagons and paper arrived with their sashes uncut and their hats too shore. The conversation that followed wasn't clean. It never is when men who like to measure meet a thing that refuses to be owned. But the creek talked. It talked in frog and in insect and in the polite slap of water on stone that says, "We will be here when your paper curls and your ink scatters." The men with wagons heard something, or didn't. They left without permission, either way. That night the town did not celebrate. It ate, it slept. People put their boots under their beds in pairs. Some dreams practiced bad endings and then woke their owners up and showed them doors out of those rooms. When morning came, bread rose. Orla's forge breathed. Myrtle's pencil found a new category, standing. She wrote names under it until the line went off the page and kept going in her head. Tamsin fixed the seam in her sleeve with smaller stitches than before. She sanded the grip of the little gun and then set it aside, and then took it up and then set it aside again. The mule nipped her sleeve and reminded her that chores made better promises than vows do. Late in the week, a letter came from North on a saddle that sounded tired. It bore the sheriff's hand, not the captain's. "We heard what you did without blood," the line read. "We heard you made a machine useless with mirrors and cloth and nerve. We would hire that street to teach ours to read." It wasn't a contract. It was an admission that some law is written in courage before it's printed in books. Tamsin read it twice and then let it sit. She had no interest in being paid to export a miracle. Miracles travel poorly. But the idea that a thing done once could be done elsewhere lit something behind her eyes like sunrise on metal. Whit passed through 2 weeks later, a sack of coffee over his shoulder, because he paid in what mattered to the person he was paying. He stood under the cottonwoods and listened to the leaves gossip, then said, "Creed's to the south, talking quiet to men who like noise. He'll either learn silence or choke on it." "Silence is a poor diet," Tamsin said, "if a man hasn't taught his stomach manners." Whit nodded, amused. "You staying?" "For now." He tilted his hat brim up enough to see both cottonwoods' crowns. "You made an orchard out of 2 trees," he said. "Careful you don't try to feed an army." "I'll feed what shows up hungry," she said, "if I can." "Then I'll see you on a road I don't take," he said, and left without leaving a dust that lingered inconveniently. One more storm came, the kind that makes roofs count their nails.
Sheets flew again, this time for purpose, for laundry rather than cover, and someone laughed in the rain, an outrageous, gentle sound that startled 6 birds into a better mood. Tamsin stood under the eave and allowed herself the small warmth of recognition. She knew this place, and it knew her, both of them wider than they had been when the machine's first teeth bit air. When night leveled the edges off the day, she placed the little gun on the table and set the leather seam beside it. She poured coffee and didn't drink it and said aloud, not to a person, but to a room that had been taught it could hold such things, "I'll stay until leaving is no longer the brave choice." The room kept the sentence like a stone keeps heat and gave it back when she grew cold thinking about the road. The mule snored. The wash went on with its business. The stars minded theirs. She wrote 2 lines in the book and closed it with care. June 29. I built the street out of angles and mercy. It stands when I sleep. I will sleep. Morning came anyway, which is the best that can be said of most miracles. Tamsin went to the rocker at the wash and worked it as if geometry hadn't been her other living all month. A fleck winked. Rent paid, beans bought. The hawk watched and approved with a rotation of head that meant nothing and everything. She smiled because the world does sometimes, out of habit and out of grace.
Behind her, once, the sound of boots did not make her flinch. She turned and saw Calder, taller than last month by 3 honest inches, and Myrtle with her ledger, and Orla with her hammer, and the baker's boy with bread. They set their burdens down and looked at the water and then at each other like people who had learned to prefer appetite to appetite's performance. "Town meeting," Myrtle said. "In a wash?" "Road's no place for it," Orla grunted. "This is where the street remembers what it's made of." Calder cleared his throat. "Some of us think we should put a sign on both ends of town," he said. "Words plain enough to make men like paper read twice." "What words?" Tamsin asked. He flushed, but did not look down. "Not today. Not this street. Not this town." She felt it like weather turning right. "At 1, she said. "Not this creek." He grinned the way boys grin when they are allowed to fix a thing that matters. "We'll need a better hammer," he said to Orla. "I got one. I keep it for days that deserve it." The sign went up by noon. Whitlaw happened by the same day and read it without smiling, which for him was rapture. A week later, a rider from the territory stopped, read, and turned around without knocking. News traveled. Some of it wrong, most of it useful to the wrong people. The town learned to live with that too. As for Creed, he put his drought eyes on other horizons and met a rain he did not respect. It dealt with him the way weather deals with men who are sure they can negotiate with sky. Word said he left the territory trying to cash pride where pride is not accepted tender. If he came back, he would come back smaller. Or not at all. The street did not plan its days around his shadow anymore. Tamsin Vale kept to her rocker and to her angles and to her ledgers no one else read. She let Jory count until numbers started scaring him and started keeping him company. She let Myrtle bully the price of flour back to reasonable, and watched Orla make a horseshoe so clean it offended a mule into walking properly for the first time all season. When she walked the boards at dusk, there were still knots that rose 1/8 of an inch, and mirrors that told the truth, and a bell that would ring when asked. Her hands still shook sometimes after they were done saving lives in ways nobody saw. She let them. She had learned that trembling is a tax the body charges the soul for insisting on principle. The seam stayed some days on, some days folded in the pocket of a coat that earned its wear. The little gun kept its patience, and she kept hers. Angles continued to be angles. Mercy continued to be work. At the end of one ordinary day that owed no one an apology, she sat on the saloon step with the book open and wrote no words at all, because sometimes the best accounting is knowing when a page doesn't need ink. Then she closed the book, stood, and went inside, where the stove waited, and the room remembered what she had told it. She would stay until leaving was no longer the brave choice. For now, today, that choice stayed right where it had been, steady as a rock in a wash that kept on singing. 2 more great stories are next. Don't miss them. Subscribe and turn on notifications.